Welcome. I'm Kevin,
And I'm Jackson.
and this is A Disciple.
And a doubter.
So, folks, today we are going to be discussing the ever so controversial topic of free will. But before we do that, I almost forgot, we shall begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy Spirit, come. Breathe your life into us. Dispel any darkness in our hearts and minds as we make space for your word. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, as I said, we'll be talking about free will today. This topic is interesting because in every episode so far, we've touched on the issue of free will for the most part. So today we're really going to be examining it directly.
Yes, we are. I suppose that we can start by discussing whether or not free will exists, whether or not it can exist. Well, first, before we do that, we should
We'll
talk about
define free will.
what is free will.
I would say
How
free
would you-
will is the ability to, I guess simply would be the ability to make a choice. But more specifically, the ability to employ your own personal rational faculties to choose one course of action over another by your own distinct will that isn't manipulated by some exterior force. If that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I think. Yeah, I think that's correct. To maybe make that a little bit more simple, I oftentimes like to think of free will as the ability to have done otherwise. So, like,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
say
that's
that
good.
I'm deciding whether I wanna work out or whether I want to stay in bed, and um, if I make the choice to work out, um, if free will exists, then
You
it
could have
could
made the
have been the
choice to stay
case
in
that I
bed.
stayed in bed. I could have made that choice.
And it would have
But if
been, the
free will,
important thing is that it would have been you actively, it would have been the result of your own personal decision that you could have remained in bed.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, Sorry, that's a good point. That's a good point. Things could have been otherwise, and the reason they could have been otherwise is because I have sufficient ability to choose. So
Yeah.
I think that's a decent baseline
I think that's
for
good.
free
So
will
then you wanted
is.
to discuss, is it possible that free will exists? Was that it?
Uh, yeah, well, yeah, I guess something of that sort.
Well, I think most people start from the obvious position of like, oh yeah, like of course free will exists. Like I
Yeah, it
could
feels
have
like
the
it for
choice
sure.
to. It certainly feels like we have free will. I have the choice to get out of bed versus. I have the choice to stay in bed versus work out. Obviously, there might be external things influencing me, like the alarm going off, or like your mom yelling up the stairs saying, "Hey, get out of bed," or whatever. But at the end of the day, you choose whether or not you want to let those things affect you. So it seems. Now, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously. There are many philosophers who contest this idea and would say that actually, in fact, no, free will does not exist as we understand it.
Right.
So you want to talk about some of those reasons?
Yeah, I think in my mind there's sort of two primary ways of arguing against free will, and one is let's say more scientific or more philosophical, and one is more moral maybe. So the first way of kind of arguing against free will, the first way people do it is they say, okay, the universe is set up in a series of uh, causes and effects that date back to the inception of the universe. So, like there was an initial cause, and that had effects, which then caused other things, which then caused other things, which then caused other things. So we have this near infinite chain of uh, causes and effects, but they all go back to like the one initial cause. And so the idea is that based on, how would you say it?
Like physical principles.
Based on the nature of the initial cause, then all of the effects which have come out of that cause had to be as they have been. So, like,
and I think a way people often explain this, like this theory is called determinism, and I think a way people often explain it is they say, all right, if we understand the laws of physics and we have a basketball, and we know every single conceivable factor about the physical conditions surrounding this basketball, like its height, its weight, the wind factor in its surrounding environment, or whatever, and we drop it off a building, then we could mathematically calculate exactly where the path that this basketball will take. And I think some people kind of think that if the universe is most fundamentally defined as just a set of physical laws, then this cascade that was started by whatever caused the Big Bang will mean that we could calculate exactly what everything within the universe will do, which would mean, which would in theory mean that just given the laws of physics, you and I were always going to have this conversation right now, which is simply unavoidable.
Right.
And if something is simply unavoidable, then it really makes you wonder, like, do we really have free will, or are we just kind of going where the math takes us?
I think that idea. Have you heard of? I think it's Laplace's demon.
No.
It's like a thought experiment or something. But the idea is similar to what you described with the basketball. That if we knew everything that there was to be known about the universe, if we knew all of the physical conditions which influence us, then we would be able to predict exactly what is going to happen I think his idea is that, like, if there was a demon or like some kind of supercomputer which was like omniscient, then it would be able to predict everything that was going to happen in the future, because the future is solely influenced by physical
physics,
things that have happened previously.
No,
so that's.
I don't know if you have anything specific that you want to talk about this, but I have some stuff I would like to say about
determinism.
About like determinism as a whole, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So I would argue against determinism, because ultimately I would argue against the fact that physics can explain everything. Now, here's all you millions of viewers, hear me out for a second. I would say that there's this understanding. I'm trying to think of where I want to begin with this argument. I think I'll begin here. I'd be willing to grant that by laws of physics, for all people who are watching this podcast, for all you people who are listening to this and not viewing, I'm currently lifting my hand up and down in demonstration of an active choice of my own will. And I'd be willing to accept the fact that given the way that the atoms of my hand are moving, but then according to the laws of physics, because they're moving in a specific way, it's guaranteed that my hand will be moving up and down. And then I would also be willing to grant the fact that the atoms are guaranteed to move in a certain way based on the motion of the subatomic particles that constitute these atoms. Like the subatomic particles interact with each other in a certain way. It causes the atoms to interact with each other in a certain way. By necessity, it causes the atoms to interact in a certain way, given laws of physics. And therefore, again, like given laws of physics and biology, it causes my hand to move in a certain way. Now, and then you could even go deeper than that. You could say, all right, well, what makes up these subatomic particles? And the point being is you could eventually get so small and so smaller and smaller and smaller till you get to the point where you're looking at the smallest physically possible thing conceivable. And so let's so these most basic units that constitute the atoms of my hand, again, I'm willing to grant that if they move in a certain way, then it would guarantee a certain effect, namely my hand moving up and down. Now, what you really have to ask yourself, though, and I think this is an actual like scientific phenomenon called quantum indeterminacy, is kind of the idea that...
Wait, Kevin. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, there's this idea called quantum indeterminacy, which, from my understanding as a non-physicist, is basically the idea on the smallest possible imaginable level, on like the most basic building block of the subatomic particle. What is there to, like, if we grant the fact that it's by the movement of subatomic particles that causes atoms to move in a certain way, that causes my hand to move in a certain way, what causes the most basic building block to move in a certain way if there is nothing physically smaller to act upon it? And that's kind of the notion of quantum indeterminacy. Like, because they're so small and there's nothing to cause them to act in a certain way, then it's indeterminate, that you can't predict by the laws of physics which way these smallest possible things are going to move, in which case it's indeterminate, in which case I would say that's definitive proof that, like, definitive logical proof that the laws of physics could only take you so far. And just given that these small particles do move in a certain way that can't be explained by laws of physics alone, it necessarily means that there must be something immaterial that isn't bound by the laws of physics that causes these smallest possible particles to act as they do. And I would say the only immaterial thing that could have a direct effect on the physical world is the mind, like consciousness, the human mind / the mind of God / a personal subjective being.
It might be helpful if I share some of my own knowledge about
Go ahead.
which is limited. But so my understanding is that like pre the early 20th century, scientists were mostly convinced that the universe was deterministic. Like Isaac Newton was a pretty hardcore determinist, and so were a lot of physicists who followed in his footsteps. And then it was some German physicist, I believe, I can't remember his name, who discovered the principle of quantum indeterminacy or something like that. And the idea is sort of what you're describing, that sort of when you like look at, when you observe the smallest possible particles, you can't predict how they're going to behave. There's an element of randomness that seems to occur at the smallest level of physics, something like that.
And I think that logically makes sense, because like, how could you get any smaller? You can't.
Mm-hmm. But so this is two things about this. One, I've heard physicists who are still determinists push back and say, well, the only reason that there is randomness at the smallest possible level is because we don't yet understand what is causing the particles to act in this way, which seems random, but actually is caused by things which we just don't yet understand. And like, I don't know exactly what evidence supports them making that assertion, but I mean, there are very reputable scientists who say that we just don't understand enough to disprove quantum indeterminacy, which, I don't know, interesting. Second thing is that randomness doesn't necessarily equate to freedom. So even if the universe isn't deterministic, even if there's an element of randomness, even if things weren't sort of predetermined from the inception of the universe, like even if particles move about in ways such that they could have moved about in other ways, this still doesn't necessarily mean that there is real human freedom, right? Like just because one particle in my brain, like does something when it could have done something else, like that still doesn't suggest that there is human freedom, unless my, this first person conscious experience that I seem to be having is somehow influencing the movement of those particles. So I think that's where we might find human freedom in this sort of understanding of quantum indeterminacy, which I think is your argument. If consciousness is the thing which is influencing the randomness that we observe at the quantum level, then there may in fact be something like free will. That's kind of.
I guess I would say that's my point, and I would say to your point on randomness, you might say, kind of like what you said. Someone might say, "Yeah, all right, I grant that there might be some on the smallest possible level. We might not be able to predict with exact certainty how these particles will move." But that doesn't necessarily, it could be random. But still, nonetheless, I think if we accept the fact, and maybe not everyone would, but if we accept the fact that every effect must have a cause, which I think basically everyone would accept that by definition, every effect must have a cause, then when we say, then there really is no such thing as pure randomness. Just by the definition of cause and effect. And I think the only thing that we know of, the only thing that's conceivable that can, let's say the only immaterial thing that we know of that can have a direct effect on the material world, like I said, is a personal mind. Because even take something else that's immaterial, like and I think we've talked about this on the show before, but take like the abstract concept of mathematics. And obviously there are things that are influenced by the properties of mathematics that have a direct effect on the material world. But if we're not looking at the physical manifestations of mathematics, but we're just thinking about the essence of mathematics itself in its most abstract, immaterial form, that cannot directly influence the physical world because it's immaterial. Whereas, like I said, the only thing we know of that's immaterial that can directly impact the physical world is consciousness itself. Like I said, a personal mind. And I think this really gets back to, a lot of people are going to struggle with this because I think we try to fit God, or maybe I shouldn't. Let me think of how I want to phrase this. There's this idea that Thomas Aquinas writes about, that God is otherly other. That's the term that he uses, meaning from the perspective of the material physical world, God is completely incomprehensible, outside of anything that we could ever hope to perceive with our physical senses. And we can really only attain God through our own intellect and abstract understanding. Because our minds are immaterial, therefore we could only understand the immaterial God using our minds. But I know I'm giving you a word salad here, but my point is that it gets to a point where physics could only take you so far, and at some point you have to start relying on the existence of the immaterial realm. And I think that's kind of what Aquinas means when he refers to God as the otherly other. And I think just logically, when you kind of examine the example that I gave you earlier about just, you look at atoms and you look to subatomic particles and you look to whatever makes up those quarks, I don't know, then whatever makes up, you get to the point where just logically you're at the smallest possible thing. I think that's proof alone that physics only takes you so far. Mm-hmm. And that there must be something outside of physics, because even practically, like, who wrote the laws of physics in the first place? I think it has to be something that isn't constrained by properties of physics, which by definition would be something utterly other, as Thomas Aquinas puts it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't think I don't have nearly a good enough grasp on physics to either support or reject that idea that there must be something immaterial underlying the laws of physics. But it seems plausible in my mind. At the very least, it seems plausible. I'm sure there would be physicists who would argue against that, but I don't know how they would do that.
I've never heard a good argument for how physics could explain literally everything.
One thing I will say to the sort of the point of there being something like free will, even in a universe that seems deterministic. And I can't remember. I might have talked about this on the episode we did, whenever that was with Nolan, but maybe I didn't.
Yeah.
But like, if you imagine a character imagine you're watching a character in a video game, like a lifelike video game, like The Sims Free Play or something. You know that game?
Yeah. Sure.
And like, imagine you're watching this character. And they're in a video game, so like you wouldn't imagine that this character has any kind of freedom. You'd imagine that they've been programmed, and maybe you have control over them, maybe you don't. But then imagine the character in the video game that seems very determined looks at you through the screen and starts just doing some crazy stuff. Like clearly is self-conscious of their situation in this ostensibly simulated video game. I think that you might think to yourself that character in the video game has something like free will because they are self-conscious of their situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And so this is sort of like, this might be something like our situation in a universe that seems deterministic, because it's like, okay, maybe it's true that, like we are just in this giant sequence of causes and effects that we can't see exactly how we would break out of. But we're very aware of our position within this sequence of causes and effects. We are very self-conscious, or so it seems. Yeah, I think this may be an obvious point, but if free will does exist, it goes hand in hand with first-person conscious experience. Another point, we've talked about Alex O'Connor before. Mm. He is not a believer in free will. But I was watching a video one time where he was arguing against it, and then at the end of the video someone asked him, what is the best argument you've ever heard for the existence of free will? And he's like, well, there's not a specific argument, but when you think about consciousness in general, we can't exactly argue, like set up a rational philosophical argument for the existence of consciousness. And in fact, someone might be able to argue against the existence of consciousness, as I think Daniel Dennett, one of the new atheists, has tried to do. And yet consciousness does exist. Like this is like the the most fundamental thing in all of philosophy. I think, therefore I am. Consciousness does exist. We just can't really explain why. And so he's like, the same could very well be true of free will, that we can't exactly explain it, but like we feel it, and in the same way we feel consciousness.
Well, I think it kind of goes back to, like I was saying, because I was trying to explain free will I was trying to explain a thing that could initiate a cause as the mind. But again, like, what is a mind? What is consciousness? We really have no idea. Like, we have this sense that a mind is just a personal force that possesses an intellect and a will and a self-understanding, like self-awareness. But the real essence of what causes a mind and what exactly our consciousness is, I don't think we could ever hope to know on this side of the second coming. Because, yeah. So,
But
I think...
but
what?
we still have a problem, Kevin. Free will still has a problem.
Yes.
Did you have anything else to say about
No,
about
I think on
determinism?
this front, we could probably move on.
Okay, because I do want to talk about. I mentioned earlier that there are sort of two primary ways of arguing against free will, and the first and the far more common way is this scientific, deterministic way of looking at
Yeah.
things.
Which I
But
think we've discussed as much as we possibly can.
yeah,
Like, it's
but
just so...
there's there's another way. There's another way too, and I think this way trips me up far more than the sort of determinism does. I've never been able to explain this in a way that made sense to anyone other than myself, but I'm going to try my best. So, okay, and
That's funny.
to do this, we're gonna consider the story of Cain and Abel from Genesis. So, like, pretty simple story. Cain's a bad guy. Doesn't do what God wants him to do. Abel's a good guy, does what God wants him to do. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves here is, if all circumstances are equal, and if Cain and Abel both have the same nature, then why does Abel do good and Cain do evil? Because, okay, if their circumstances were for some reason different, then we can explain why Abel does good. We can attribute it to his circumstances. And if their natures were for some reason different, if Cain was just a bad-natured individual or possessed a bad state of soul, then we can also explain why Cain does good and Abel does evil. It's because of their natures. But if either circumstance or nature are an explanation for action, then there is no freedom, right? Because we wouldn't necessarily fault Cain for doing bad because he was influenced by bad circumstances, nor would we fault him for doing bad because he possessed a bad nature. Those seem to be out of his control. Therefore, there is no freedom. So, okay, we make all things equal. We say, Cain and Abel had the same circumstances and the same nature. Why then does Abel do good and Cain do evil? And I don't know how we can answer that question in a way that allows for there to be free will. Does that make sense?
I think it kind of makes sense. Here, I'm trying to think. When you say that Cain's circumstances, that their nature and circumstances were equal, I wouldn't agree with that.
I'm not saying they were equal. I'm saying that if they're not, okay. Sorry, go ahead, and then I'll.
Well, I was gonna say their exact circumstances would not be equal. I mean, even like take my brother and I. We were born into the same family, same mom, same dad. But obviously, the exact particulars of our life circumstances are not equal. Like,
right.
We have different eye colors, we have different hair, we have different whatever. Mm-hmm. So, we have different minds, most importantly. So, by that fact, circumstances are not equal. And like we share the same human nature, but how that human nature is expressed is certainly not equal. Again,
Mhm.
even taking physical attributes, like I'm taller than he is, or whatever. And so, and you made the point that if nature and circumstance are not equal, then that limits a person's freedom.
If so, not necessarily, but if nature, either nature or circumstance, are the reason that a person acts in the way that they do, then technically there can't be
Okay,
any
yeah,
freedom.
I see what you're saying. The key
Right.
word that you use there is if the nature and the circumstance are the reason they act as they do, which I would say nature slash circumstance certainly influence how people act, but I would not, nor would any free will believing Christian contend that circumstance is the reason we do things. Because then you would mean that you could never assign moral blame to anyone,
That's yes.
which no Christian would contend.
But okay, so I like maybe I don't know. I wanted to go somewhere else, but it might be interesting to talk about how Aquinas looks at free will, because I have sort of engaged with his argument quite a bit, and I think it might be insightful for this conversation.
Go
So
ahead.
Aquinas basically makes the same argument that you just made, or makes the same point that you just made. He says, okay, we are certainly influenced by our circumstances and our nature, sometimes to a significant degree, but we aren't totally dictated by them. He says the reason for this is because we aren't animals; we are rational beings. We have the ability to not just act instinctually based on our circumstances and nature, but to sort of, consider our options, consider the ways in which we might act, consider which are better and which are worse, and then act according to our rational evaluation.
So Aquinas, just to kind of fit that into the framework we established earlier, Aquinas would not be a determinist, because
No.
he would be saying that the mind, or as you say, our rational nature, has the ability to dictate how we act given our circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
I'm hoping I can remember. There's an important point here, and I'm hoping I can remember it. And I discovered this. I was having a conversation with ChatGPT at like midnight one night about free will,
Or you should
which is
truthfully
totally
instead.
ridiculous. Truthfully?
Truthfully, it's a Catholic AI. You have to
No.
pay like $25 a year though, which I figured is
Okay.
worth it. So anyway, keep going.
But I was having a conversation with ChatGPT about free will because I have no friends other than anyway.
ChatGPT. All right.
And so I was asking it about Aquinas' argument, because I'm like, if anyone in human history has ever proved free will in a definitive way, it's got to be Aquinas. And hold up, let me see if I can pull this up real quick. If I can't find it in like 15 seconds. Okay. I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Oh my gosh. It's 38 pages. Well, okay, whatever. I'm not going to go look through that because it's going to waste time and we don't have a ton of time. But it got to the point during the conversation where ChatGPT was like Aquinas has to maintain that he can't explain why some people do good and some people do evil in a way that's independent of circumstances or nature. So even if he thinks that that sort of independent cause for the difference in the way people act exists, he has no way of explaining it or providing evidence for it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Aquinas says our circumstances and our nature don't entirely dictate our action. There's something else. But Aquinas has to maintain that he doesn't know what that something else is. It can't be proven. He kind of has to assert that it's there.
Well, I think that kind of goes back to what we were saying about the mind. Like, we don't really understand what the mind is or how exactly it operates, but we could attest to the fact that the mind does exist. Just by virtue of the fact that, like, physics could only take you so far. And I know we've kind of switched from we were talking in terms of, like, physics and physical properties, and now we're kind of using the language of circumstance, which I guess is a little more broad. But I would say, I think this is kind of just goes back to the discussion we were having earlier, in that you would say circumstance dictates / strongly influences how people act in the same way that, like, the physical properties of the universe dictate how people act. And then the question becomes, if it isn't purely just physical properties of the universe, or in a broader sense, or a more macro sense, someone's life circumstances, then what is the thing then that's the golden question, I guess. Then what is it?
Yes,
that does
influence? Let me say this one thing to clarify my Cain and Abel example from earlier. So the reason that I made all their circumstances and their nature equal is so that we, like, then we're focusing on that independent thing which would sort of
be sure. So I would say,
all things equal, it seems that if circumstances and nature are equal, then Cain and Abel would act in the exact same way. But
they do not.
But they do not. Mm-hmm. But we might imagine that their circumstances and nature were something.
Okay, sure. So
that explains their difference.
Obviously, circumstances are never the exact same, but I think that's not even important to the question. I think I get what you're saying. It's, if we are to just say that these circumstances are equal, then it's not a guarantee that people will act in the same way. And then in a similar case, so, like, obviously there are people who grow up. Like, a common case is someone say, "Oh, I was abused as a child, so that's the reason why I abuse my children today, because the scars from my traumatic childhood." But then you would say, "Oh, someone else who was abused as a child might live their life being a perfectly loving father or mother." And so we even see that play out in real life. And I guess you would say, I guess you can get in the weeds of examining, like, oh, this person's circumstance differentiated itself in this specific way, but then you kind of get back into the determinist mode of thinking. All right, so I guess let me really get at what you're saying here. Let's just take an imaginable scenario of two people having the exact same circumstances and the exact same nature. And can it be possible that they act in a way that pleases God? One acts in a way that pleases God, and one acts in a way that displeases God. And I would say yes. And firstly, like, yeah, I would say yes, because I do believe in the subjectivity of man, meaning we each have our own distinct intellects and wills, which allows us to choose one thing over the other. And I believe in that because, like I said, I don't think the physics takes us far enough to say that knowing the exact circumstances could dictate an exact outcome. because I believe in the existence of the immaterial realm, namely the existence of the human mind in this case.
I think the reason for me that this more moral way of framing arguments against free will is even more difficult to work around is because it includes immateriality. So, like, let's assume that all of Cain and Abel's material circumstances were the same. But I'll also grant that they both have a soul, or some kind of immaterial part of them, which we can call a soul or consciousness, whatever.
Or a mind or whatever.
And, okay, maybe... What?
I didn't say anything.
So, maybe this thing can explain, in a non-material way why Cain and Abel act differently. But then we would still have to ask, well, like, why does Abel then seem to possess a good soul, whereas Cain seems to possess
I would say
bad-natured soul.
They would have,
because if
I think that goes back to their nature. You said earlier, you were saying that they would have the same human nature. So I wouldn't say Cain has I wouldn't say he's starting from the position of having a worse soul.
Well, okay, the fact that I use circumstance and nature is confusing. I meant circumstance. So circumstance and nature would both be material factors. I meant circumstance as external things which influence people, and I meant nature as internal things that are.
So I would equate nature with the soul.
Okay, so let's scrap the word nature and let's just use circumstance to denote material factors acting upon a person. Is that fair?
Okay. Yeah.
So then, and we'll use nature to talk about the state of someone's soul, the immaterial parts of a person. So I think hold up, let me get my thoughts together. So, if all of Cain and Abel's circumstances are equal, but we still know that one does good and one does bad, then okay, we now look to their nature, to the immaterial part, and for an explanation as why they act differently. And I think the only explanation that I can come up with is that Abel, for whatever reason, possessed a better state of soul than Cain did. Because if also both of their souls were equal in substance, then I think they would have acted in the same way. Either they both would have done good or they both would have done bad. But they don't both do good or both do bad. One does good, one does bad. So
all right, so here's the question.
A different state of soul.
Here's the question. Would be why... Because I guess I agree with you that Abel's soul is better than Cain's.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question is, why is Abel's soul better than Cain's? Is it because he of the choices he makes using his own free will? Or did God create him from a worse off starting point? Is really the question, I think.
But so the explanation that Abel with his own free will made better choices than Cain, which then contributed to his soul being of a better nature. Well, the question is, if they were starting out from the same point, then why did Abel make better choices with his free will and Cain worse choices with his free will, if they were starting out from the same point? Because we've said circumstances are equal, and they're starting out from the same point as far as state of soul goes. So why, with Abel's free will, does he make better choices than Cain? And I don't think we can explain this. I'm not asserting that as a definitive conclusion, because I it seems like there could be an explanation that exists, but I've thought about it quite a bit, and I am yet to come up with an explanation.
Well, I think it goes back to the explainable facts that it is inexplainable. Like it kind of goes back to what I'm saying in that you're right. They have the same, because I think I fully understand the scenario now. They have the same. We're assuming they have the same exact circumstances and the same exact like nature of the same starting point. So the reason they deviated again has to be something inexplainable, which then leads me to say it has to be something immaterial, like something otherly other that we can't comprehend, but that we know does exist. Namely, again, human subjectivity.
Yes, except what I think I'm very willing to grant that as a possibility. But what we also shouldn't forget about is that in this hypothetical in which we are making all circumstances and nature equal, this hypothetical does not approximate reality, because circumstances and nature are never totally equal, which is a point you made earlier. So, like, if everyone's circumstances and nature were equal, and yet people still acted differently, then we would know that there was this immaterial thing that did exist, which could explain why people acted differently, which was our free will. But the thing is that circumstances and nature are not equal, and they are the sort of disparity in circumstance and nature is a good explanation for a real explanation for why people act differently. And so
I guess you would say because we can never test it, because we'll never have the exact same circumstances.
Yep.
Then it could be the case that it actually is circumstances that dictate people's actions.
I think it's very, very plausible, but
Or perhaps even looking back at the nature side of things, maybe they didn't actually start out with the same starting point. Like maybe maybe it was God's fault that Cain's soul was rotten, kind of thing, or that he ended up doing these bad things.
Yeah.
And
that was
That was a what?
That was sorry. You just used the language from my the script I sent you about people's souls being rotten and it being God's fault.
Oh, did I?
Guys, I made it.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Anyway. All right, I almost want to put the circumstances question aside because I feel like in some ways we beat that horse to death already.
Okay.
In our talks with determinism and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess let's examine the nature question for a second, where we say they have the exact same circumstances, but they don't do the same thing. Like we know the one thing we know for a fact is that they don't do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that their souls and that they are different in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so the question really is what causes this difference? And you might not agree with this, but I'm going to say for a second that we know it's not circumstances because this is just my opinion, because I know definitively that physics doesn't explain everything, and I'm equating physics and circumstances here, and that there has to be some sort of mind involved. Then the question becomes, is it the mind of God in creating their souls that cause the effect to be different? Or is it the mind of each individual man? And that cause their effect to be different. And I would say I'm trying to think of how I could explain the fact that it is not the mind of God that causes. I think if you have an understanding of God as like the perfect person, like the perfect divine intellect and will, then I would say by definition, if there is someone who's rotten, out of line with perfection, then it can't be God's will. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been God. Because if God is pure goodness by just philosophical definition of God.
But that would still, that's an assumption, correct? That is an assumption. The assumption there is that God is pure goodness. I mean, I would say that is an assumption that someone would have to grant or could potentially reject.
Well,
it's not a matter of fact that God is pure goodness.
I would say,
at least as far as I can see. I mean, I would like to believe that that's the case, but it's not a matter of fact.
Well, but I think, well, I would say it would be because, like, I would say it would be a matter of fact that God is pure goodness, because if God is not goodness, if God is not pure goodness, then that would mean that there's something greater than God, namely whatever is pure goodness, that God fails to live up, that this God who isn't pure goodness fails to live up to. In which case, I would say that thing that is greater, because goodness is relative. But by that I mean, like, we would say God isn't, if we were to say God isn't pure goodness, it would only be because we're comparing this version of God to something else that we would call goodness. And I would say whatever that other thing is that we would call goodness would actually be the true God, if that makes sense.
But I think this is maybe contingent on our very human understanding of what goodness is. Because I think what you're saying is that the greatest possible thing must necessarily be the greatest possible, the most good possible thing.
Yeah.
So by definition, it's that thing is perfectly good.
Yeah.
So a perfectly good thing shouldn't be the explanation for bad things like Cain doing bad stuff and murdering his brother. But that's we're making that assertion or making that assumption from our human perspective of looking at things. But we've also, as we've said multiple times throughout this episode, we have a very limited ability to comprehend or speak about this greatest possible thing. So it seems very plausible that the greatest possible thing just doesn't have the same understanding of goodness that we have. I'm not saying that's that's definitely the case, but like we do have to admit that.
So you're saying that this greatest possible thing,
relying on our understanding of goodness, which
so that greatest possible thing, if that greatest possible thing, which doesn't align with our understanding of goodness, causes Cain to act in a way that we would perceive as evil, then it would mean that the way Cain is acting isn't actually evil in reality. Because he's doing it, like, it seems like evil, but it's really not, because he's actually abiding by the will of the greatest possible thing.
Dinner? Okay. Yep. Okay.
Did you hear the point I was making?
I did, but I do have to go to dinner.
Okay.
Here, just make the point real quick, and then we'll put a pin in this, and we can pick up.
Okay. No worries. The point was that if Cain is actually possessed by the greatest possible thing to act as he does in a way that seems evil to us, in reality, sorry, there's a period there. In reality, he's not actually acting in an evil way because he's doing it by the will of the greatest possible thing. And even though it seems evil, it's really not, and therefore there's no injustice.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. We'll pick up there next episode.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sorry. See you next time. Thanks for listening, guys.
All right. So long, everyone.